So hello everyone and welcome to IAP2 Canada and IAP2 USA's monthly webinar. Today's webinar is Failing Forward, How to Turn Past Setbacks into Future Successes. And so it's a real pleasure that we welcome all of you today on behalf of both IAP2 Canada and IAP2 USA. And what we're going to do first is I'm going to ask Drew to quickly run through some housekeeping items on how to participate in today's webinar. Then I'm subsequently going to introduce Ashley Good, and then we're going to be handing it over to Ashley, who's also going to be asking you to participate throughout this remainder of today's hour. So please pay full attention to Drew so that you know how you too can be an active participant in today's event. So Drew, over to you, please.
All right. Well, as Amelia said, we're trying to keep this as interactive as possible, and it's an opportunity for us to share in a lot of different ways here. So there are ways that you can share. We have our question box, and if you just want to write your question out there, Amelia will see it, and she will ask the question of Ashley at the appropriate time. And then, or you can just ask the question on the side, and Amelia or I can get back to you with the response to that. So you got the question box there. There's also the feature, the raised hand, and you see there's a little icon that looks sort of but not quite unlike a hand, and you can click that, and that will show up on our screen as indicating that you've got your hand raised. And once again, in that case, Amelia can call on you, and you can actually ask your question verbally of Ashley during the presentation. Also, we're going to be using the question box in a different way. Ashley has got some poll questions coming up, and some of them will require some further expansion on your response. So feel free to use the question box there. We've got all your microphones muted right now, so if you have your own mic on your computer, your headset, whatever you're using, if you've got that muted, please take it off mute, because then if you have something you want to say, we'll unmute your microphone and you'll be able to talk. But if you've got it muted and we unmute you, then you're still muted. So leave it to us, and we will keep control over the microphones as much as we can. This webinar is being recorded, as all our webinars are, and we keep them around for your professional development use, and they are available to members only or to those non-members who have paid to take part in this. And we usually have that up, we say within 48 hours, usually it's more like 2 hours that it takes for us to get it posted, and we'll send you a note indicating where it is and how you can log in to review this, and any other collateral materials we can make available to you as well. So with that, I will let Amelia take things over again and introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you very much, Drew. So now it is with sincere pleasure that I get to introduce Ashley Good. Ashley is the founder and chief executive officer of Fail Forward, an organization that helps other organizations make lemons out of lemonade. Now based in Toronto, Ashley spent a year in Cairo with the United Nations Environment Program and another in Ghana with Engineers Without Borders Canada. During that time, she saw amazing people whose creativity and potential for learning was stifled due to risk aversion and fear of failure. And she knew it was time for some bold new approaches to solve some of our toughest challenges. She started Fail Forward in 2011 and remains focused on helping organizations use failure as a catalyst for learning and innovation. Coming up in July, Ashley's organization is holding a one-day event in Toronto, a Fail Forward 2014. And we'll be sharing that information with all of you either on the IAP2 websites or when we send out the webinar information. So without any more comments, Ashley, I'm now going to hand it over to you. And again, this is meant to be interactive, so don't hesitate to send us those questions. Ashley.
Thank you, Amelia and Drew. I'm just getting my presentation up here on the screen. So as Amelia and Drew mentioned, I feel I need to put a disclaimer on this webinar and warn you that I will be asking for lots of audience participation, and I recognize that there's a natural challenge in this given that we are using the webinar format, and so I'm asking for your help to make sure that this works. As Drew and Amelia have said, you can put the answers to any questions that I ask you into the question box. Plus, I'll have 3 poll questions to make sure that we keep this presentation interactive. Finally, I should mention at some point in the next hour, I will be asking for volunteers to share a failure story of their own. So perhaps you want to get yourself ready for that request as well. Without further ado, I will get started. And I'd like everyone who's listening to just think of the word failure. And what comes to mind? What words pop into your head when you think of failure? And again, you can just plop those words right in the question box. What comes to mind when you think of failure?
So Ashley, we don't have anything from anyone yet, so I'm still waiting for them. Learning, negative, shame, learning, inexperience, not good enough, fear. So here they come. Trouble, rock bottom.
Trouble, yeah.
So those are quite a few of the ones that that have just popped into us.
Well, thank you all for this experiment in audience participation via webinar. This slide that I'm showing now is the cover of the annual Engineers Without Borders Failure Report. This particular edition, it was last year's edition, it is 27 pages, 14 stories that prove that Engineers Without Borders failed at least, but probably more, than 14 times last year. So given that, what are the words that pop into mind when you think of this organization and the people who wrote these stories to be published publicly? What are the words that pop into your mind when you think of them? And again, just use the question box.
Brave. Very brave. Public good. Useful, honest, accountability, analytical, there's authentic.
That's great.
Yep. So transparent, outside the box thinking, solution finding. So those are all some great words for you to go on, Ashley.
Yeah, and again, thank you. Now, do you notice a difference? It is truly amazing how differently we perceive failure and our experience of failure compared with how we perceive people and organizations who fail. And it's truly in that spirit of expanding our perceptions of failure that I was invited to give this webinar today. So this is me, and as someone whose entire job revolves around failure, or as my mom likes to say, I'm a full-time failure, you would rightly assume that I have quite a few stories of my own to share. And when people ask me to talk about failures, as they often do, my most common response is, would you like that chronologically or alphabetically? So I won't share all my stories with you today, but I would like to share one story. And this is the one that truly propelled me to start the organization that I now run called Fail Forward. So I had been leading the Engineers Without Borders Failure Report and saw a lot of potential in the idea of publishing failure stories publicly as a means to generate a culture where learning and innovation thrive. So I started a website called Admitting Failure. And I designed this as a database where anyone could publish their story of failure and learning for all to learn from. And you could search it by location and project type. And I imagined never again would mistakes be repeated because this database would be home to thousands and thousands of stories. And I pitched this idea of this website to Engineers Without Borders, claiming it would catalyze a new era of collaborative learning. Now, 3.5 years later, the site has a whopping 32 stories on it. And in fact, 6 months into the project, Engineers Without Borders cut all the funding to it. And I was left with the irony that a website about failure had, in fact, failed. But to be honest, my real failure happened in the months that followed that. Because having this idea that I had poured so much of my heart and soul into, having that rejected made me feel so vulnerable and stupid and weak. And I was too scared to do something interesting, to break that mold and fight for the idea that I believed in. So I let the project get cut, took a very normal position with Engineers Without Borders. That by all objective measures was a good job, but it just didn't quite align with what I cared about. So I kept doing this failure work on the side, but to be honest, I was pretty miserable for months. It took me ages to realize that I had other options. And it was actually a fateful chat with my mom where she pushed me to tell her what I really loved. And there's something about that conversation, the light bulb went off, and I just realized I had to pursue this failure idea. So I took the leap, and I planned a meeting with the Director of Strategy and Investment at Engineers Without Borders, Boris, so that I could tell him that I was going to leave the perfectly good job that he had offered me in order to focus on the project that he had cut just months before. And I was so scared of his reaction. I still remember sitting across from him, my hands were shaking like crazy, and it took everything in me just to keep my voice steady to get the words out to quit my job. But he ended up being really supportive and proud that I had found some courage to really pursue an idea that I was passionate about, despite the odds and despite the fact that he had cut. And me, I was left with no choice but to make it work. I mean, I cut up my safety net, quit my job, and here's where I first felt that propellant force of failure. And that propellant force is what eventually forced me to turn the admitting failure idea into the organization I now run called Fail Forward. But before this story ends up sounding like one of those failure stories that is really just a success story dressed up like a failure, I should mention that, yes, I'm excited about my work with Fail Forward, but only because it still terrifies me. I can't tell you how often I come home after trying some new idea that totally flops and can't get the, ugh, I'm terrible at my job thought out of my head. So this is not a success story, but rather I look at it as a just do something story. And I say it this way because school, and honestly most of our jobs, teach us to be consumers, both of knowledge and of products. And that's fine to be consumers of knowledge. I love learning from others. It's great. But I really want to encourage people with this story to start thinking of themselves both as consumers and producers. You know, don't be afraid to create, to build, to do something. You know, what do you want to do? What's the change that you want to see? How do you see yourself being a part of that change? Do that. Do anything. Build that minimum viable product. Try it, create it, test it. And accept that it will very likely fail, at least on the first try. The moral of the story really comes back to the fact that it took me ages to get over my failure. But we need to get beyond our failures to find that courage to produce, that courage to act and to create. And through that experience that took me too long to overcome, I realized that failure and getting over it is an essential skill, and it's one that we're simply not taught. You know, we are, if you really think about it, only ever taught how to succeed. We study successes, invest in the tools and strategies that promise it, emulate successful role models. By contrast, all we're taught about failure is to avoid it at all costs. And when we think about it that way, it should come as no surprise then that we react badly when failures happen. I mean, it's a skill we've never been taught, let alone mastered. But I'm still talking about failure as all negative, shameful, and fatal. And when I know a different side of failure, and I know it can be a catalyst for creativity, collaboration, learning. So I want to tell you a different kind of failure story to balance that out. And this story was told to me by a woman who came up to me after one of the very first talks I gave. And she came up to me excited to tell me the story when she immigrated to Canada as a young girl. And like so many new immigrants, she felt socially excluded. She wanted more than anything to fit in, to be a real Canadian kid, and to her, that meant playing ice hockey. And fortunately enough, she had parents that had the means to enroll her in a team, so she joined her local hockey team, and she went to every single practice. She was absolutely determined to be the best hockey player ever, because that's what would make her Canadian. She carefully executed each drill, trying to get it just right every time, until her coach, about 3 weeks into the practices, pulls her aside and says, "Amina, you are just not falling enough." To which Amina looks back up at her coach and says, "I know, I'm trying to be the best hockey player ever." To which her coach says, "No, Amina, practice is for finding your edge. You need to know that exact place between when you're standing up in your skate blade and you're laying face down on the ice. And you need to know where that edge is so you can push into every play, in every corner, and every shot as hard as you can. And how do you know where that edge is if you never fall?" So Mina takes her coach's advice after this, starts falling all over the place. And I love it when she told this part of the story, because her eyes lit up and she gets so excited. And she says, "And I got so much better so quickly after that." And of course, right, we instinctively know this. We know how much our learning is accelerated when we push ourselves to the edge of our capacities. As a kid, we know this. You know, we call it practice. Nobody says, "I'm going to go fail at piano now." I'm going to practice piano. We're hardwired to learn this way. But something happens as we become adults. We start to exert more control over our surroundings, only do things we already know how to do. And I get it. The stakes are higher as adults. But that doesn't mean we can allow ourselves to stop trying, to stop practicing, to stop pushing ourselves to the edge. It is very much a choice to see failure differently, as a child does, and to reframe it as learning and as practice. But as the image on your screen now will show, choosing to see failure differently is easier said than done, because our human tendency is to react defensively in times of failure. So when we're at the bottom of a failure, it's very hard to think of it from the perspective of a learning. Instead, we tend to deny responsibility, blame external factors, ignore the failure, try to fix it before anyone notices. It is precisely these kinds of defensive reactions that are preventing us from learning. But it's also the awareness of these reactions that allows us to change. So I encourage everyone, when you fail, to try to choose that challenging option, that non-instinctive one, to acknowledge, accept, and even reframe your failure in terms of what you learned from it. I'm going to ask you to reframe a failure now, because reframing our failures in terms of learning is what allows us to speak openly about them. So I'm going to get you to take just the next few seconds of silence and just think about a time that you failed. So now, I'm going to give you another few seconds of silence, but this time I want you to think of that same failure, but reframe it in terms of a learning. You know, how are you, let that shame and regret and the pain of that failure go, and instead think of it in terms of what you learned, or perhaps how you're better because that failure happened. And again, just a few seconds of silence. So I'll ask you, what would our lives be like if every time we failed, instead of pointing fingers, we simply just asked ourselves, what did I learn? And every time a coworker, peer, or partner failed, instead of blaming or punishing them, we asked with appreciation and curiosity, what did you learn? Obviously, these questions get us focusing solely on the learning aspect of failure, and I do this on purpose because this is a tool that we can use to start decoupling our ego from our activity. And it's by separating ourselves from the failure that it becomes easier to speak openly about our stories and see them from a learning perspective. And this is important because, as Eddie Obeng talks about in his book, The World After Midnight, learning to fail intelligently is, in fact, an essential skill. He talks about how the pace of change of our world has surpassed our ability to learn or have the knowledge needed to solve our most important and complex challenges. And before that shift happened, he argues that if you failed, perhaps you deserve to be punished because the answer was out there somewhere. You just needed to look in the right place or ask the right person. But since that shift happened, we're increasingly bumping up against problems we simply do not have answers to. And all we can do in that space is to try something, learn from what works and what doesn't, adapt accordingly, and in this way muddle our way to a workable but ever-changing solution. And it's this muddling that is a big part of what it means to fail intelligently. And my sense is that public participation is full of problems that simply don't have straightforward, knowable answers. And because of the uncertainty and interconnectedness of your work, my guess is that just about everyone on this call has tried things that simply didn't work or didn't go as planned. And I would like to take a break here to get a sense of what that looks like for the folks on this call through our first polling question. So I'm not sure how this polling works, but I'm leaving it to Drew to figure out the technical side of this. But I want to open up the question that asks, when I have failed in the past, the failure was related to, and then there are 5 options for you to choose from.
So thanks, Ashley. And that quick poll is now up on the screen for people to respond to. And the 5 different options are the process, wrong people, wrong timing, wrong method, the outcome, the knowledge from P2 wasn't used, others, past failures, something else, or I've never failed before. So we'll give you maybe another 10 seconds to respond to that. So I'll ask everyone to please select one or more of the following if it responds to your experiences with failure. So we'll close it down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So Drew, the outcome. Oh, and the outcome is the process, wrong people, wrong timing, wrong method. 93% have experienced that. On the outcome, 47%. The knowledge from P2 wasn't used. Others, past failures, is only 13%, Ashley. Something else, so something completely different, was 33%. And you know what? We have a very honest participant group today because apparently nobody has never failed. It was 0. So over to you.
Thank you. It's really great to get a sense of what failure looks like in your context. And from this poll, I mean, it becomes obvious when you have uncertainty and independence, both of which I know exist in P2, some degree of failure is inevitable. So I'm not surprised to see that everyone has failed at something in the past. We're all in good company here. And I just want to say thank you very much for your courage to share. I often talk about reacting to failures productively and sharing our stories as if it's easy, when I very much acknowledge that it is not. And it's hard not just because our human tendency is to react dysfunctionally, but also because most of us don't have a lot of buffer in our work to allow for trying and failing and muddling. And it's really hard to take responsibility for our failures and share what we've learned when there are consequences and risks real risks involved. Changing the way we view failure is a huge transformation, but one that is vital, as Eddie Obeng pointed out, to solving our most important and complex challenges. So you've already started this transformation by answering that poll question and sharing how you failed in the past. But the question remains, how do we actually allow ourselves to try and fail and muddle our way to workable solutions when that often comes with so much risk? So I picked up the language to answer this question from Reading HBR. Charlie Lee, in his article, talks about defining your limits. So figuring out how much and what risks and failures are acceptable. I mean, you're clearly defining the walls of this sandbox and communicating the rules of engagement within those walls, basically saying this is how much risk we are willing to take to achieve our goal, so operate within it. The kid in this slide very obviously has defined a large risk sandbox. Most of ours will be at least slightly more restrictive, but regardless of the size, it's useful to say explicitly what kinds of failures are acceptable in pursuit of solving these important challenges and what is just too much. The risk, what I like to refer to as the risk sandbox, your definition of how you will balance the need for innovation to keep up with the rapid pace of change and balance that with accountability to achieving your end goals and providing value. So the point is to realize that the risk of failure is going to be part of your uncertain and interconnected work. And being good at solving these problems doesn't mean never failing. It means accepting a certain level of failure and learning through that experience. The financial sector is not necessarily the first place I would go looking for lessons in how to deal productively with failure, but there is a really good lesson in how financial investors approach risk. And you've probably heard of it, generally referred to as the risk-return profile. They know they have to accept a certain level of risk in order to generate the financial returns that they want to see. Now I'm going to make a bit of a jump here and zoom out to talking about the public participation sector as a whole. And I propose that if we're looking at the sector as a whole, that the same financial investor risk mindset applies to creating space for innovation needed to keep up with the pace of change in our world. So we need to accept a certain level of failure in order to generate that kind of big, bold, courageous thinking and action that's needed to help the P2 sector innovate and keep up with the pace of change. So if your risk sandbox happens to be small, that's fine. You know, that makes sense in your context. But recognizing that that's going to keep the public participation sector at the status quo, or perhaps seeing incremental changes. Whereas if you have a larger risk box and a higher tolerance for failure, then you give yourself the opportunity to test out those new and big ideas. So zooming back to your particular role, regardless of how big your individual risk sandbox is, I would argue that your role is to help your organization push for innovation, to move up that red arrow and allow space to try new things, to learn and adapt. Because in a rapidly changing world, the question becomes not how to keep yourself free from failure, but how to help your work become what it needs to be in the future. Now, shifting away from sandboxes and financial sectors, I want to focus our attention back on where we started, the word failure. Most of us have been trained in what Todd Johnson likes to call dysfunctional bifurcated thinking. Basically, it just means we see things as either right or wrong, good or bad, success or failure, which can be extremely problematic when almost everything we do, whether that's at home, raising kids, being a partner to our spouse, as well as in your P2 work, you know, almost everything we do has elements of both success and failure. I mean, even the word failure is incredibly problematic. One of the more amusing consequences of putting fail in your business title is that I get questioned on it just about every single day, and with good reason. I mean, failure, it's so final, so static, when the real nature of the experience is quite dynamic and fluid. As Sarah Lewis talks about in her book, Rise, the moment that we start to move past our failure, it actually ceases to be what we just named it. So the definition itself is inadequate, and that it fails to capture how dynamic and changing the experience of failure often is. Even the word success has its own gray area too. There's a well-studied effect called the Einstein effect, which describes how success has this funny way of blocking us from seeing how to do things in any other way, even when other ways are more efficient. And what's more, failure, both failure and the flip side success, our definitions of these change with time and criteria and perspective. If you get 5 people in a room telling their perspective on a failure, I can guarantee you will have 5 different stories. And the richness and depth of learning that's possible is amazing when you accept all of those perspectives as true and valid and useful. So building off this idea and this tendency towards dysfunctional bifurcated thinking, school also teaches us to believe that there is one right answer. And if you don't figure it out, then you are stupid or unvalued or a failure. And in this way, school often leads us to a way of thinking that is quite linear. We tend to solve problems that only have one correct solution. And the best example that I found of how unhelpful this way of thinking is comes from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is this fun, comical piece of science fiction. But in this book, there's this group of hyper-intelligent pan-dimensional beings who have built a supercomputer called Deep Thought. And they built this computer to answer the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. And it takes Deep Thought 7.5 million years to compute and check the answer. And at the end of 7.5 million years, Deep Thought's answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything is 42. Totally absurd, but also telling in terms of how we approach complexity and uncertainty. We tend to approach our big questions and problems as if they are linear and solvable, as if there's one right answer. That's not the world we live in. Looking back at what Eddie Obeng said, our most important and complex problems that we're bumping up against every day simply don't have one right and knowable answer. So how we view failure needs to change. First off, it doesn't look like a big red F on your test, and it certainly is not, as the dictionary describes it, a lack of success. I like to say, in our non-linear world, that failure is simply a teachable moment. It's something we can learn from. That's not to say, I mean, you'll never hear me say, let's celebrate or embrace our failures, mostly because I know and frequently see how much pain and shame and regret failure comes with. But when we find the resolve to challenge our instinctive reactions to failure, treat them as teachable moments, and share the experience in terms of what we learn, that is worth celebrating. So in this slide, I'm going to attempt to pull all of these pieces of knowledge that I've been talking about together with this model that I use to describe what it means to fail intelligently. So as we saw in the poll, we've all failed. So let's start with step 1, with a failure. Now, because we're not taught how to fail well, our tendency in times of failure is to default to our instinctive reactions, which are often self-criticism, blame, avoidance, etc. And to be honest, I think about this all the time. This is my job, and I still catch myself reacting defensively and dysfunctionally in times of failure. But as I mentioned, you do have a choice, and you can choose to move along this intelligent failure loop and move to maximize learning. I actually see a lot of examples of organizations that have institutionalized this practice of maximizing learning through things like after-action reviews and postmortems, and actually the failure report, Engineers Who Abort This Failure Report, is a perfect example of a process that helps us maximize learning in times of failure. But if we exit at that point, generally what we see is that those teams that take part in that practice, they do a job of learning, but it's not necessarily applied to the organization or codified into the organization to make sure that that mistake is not repeated again. But if we, and actually there's a really good example from the 2012 Engineers Who Abort This Failure Report where my favorite story submitted that year was called Failing to Learn from the Failure Report. And what happened was in 2011, team failed. They wrote it up for the failure report, which was all great. They maximized learning. But then next year, the same mistake or a very similar mistake was made again. So Alex Brown here, who was a part of it, wrote up this story as a failure to basically institutionalize that learning and see improvements to the organization. But if we choose to stay on the intelligent failure loop, we move to improved iterations. And this is actually a really good place. This is where we start to see incremental changes. So we're able to try something, fail at it, learn from that failure, and improve and become stronger because of it. So that's good. That's a learning loop. But there's one more step in this loop that's really at the heart of what makes intelligent failure special, in that if we recognize that we are building our ability to try things, take those smart risks, fail, learn from that failure and become a stronger organization. Because of it, we're doing what Chris Argyris refers to as double loop learning, or learning how to learn. And that skill can be applied across the organization to allow us to take more risks and innovate more, because we know that we'll become stronger on the other side. So that's where we move along to that fourth step of the loop, where we're able to take informed risks and innovate more, which inevitably, if we're doing that, we're going to end up with another failure, but of course a very different failure this time around. So with this model in front of you, I want to ask the second poll question, which is, what are the barriers that you perceive to building a more productive relationship with failure, whether that's individually or organizationally? So basically what I'm saying here is, yes, this model is great in theory, but when you look at it, what barriers do you perceive to actually making it work in your context?
So thanks very much, Ashley. The poll is now in front of the participants on the participant screen, and there are the 5 different options. There's no time to reflect, failure is not an option, tendency to fix the blame when something goes sideways, there's no role models, or other. And if you do have an other, we would encourage people to pop that into the questions, and so that we can bring that back to Ashley's attention. So I'll encourage everyone to vote now. And I'm going to close it down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Stu, what did we get? Okay. So Ashley, I'm not sure if you can see this, but it's interesting. The response is no time to reflect and learn, and leadership doesn't value it. 100%. 100%. Failure is not an option in my organization was 8%. The tendency to fix blame when something goes sideways was 42%. There was no role models for dealing with failure productively, 42%. And there were some ones that came out in others, so I'll give those to you. One of them was to hide or to bury the failures. And the other one was just the fear of failure. Oh, there's more coming in now. Fear of failure, so sort of the whole idea of shame and embarrassment. And then the other one was a lack of creativity in the organization. So a few reasons for that. So back over to you. And thanks everyone for participating.
Yeah, thank you everyone. So I'm going to try another little experiment with the webinar format and interactivity, and I'll just pause here to see if anyone has examples that they're interested in sharing of ways they were perhaps able to overcome these barriers, you know, and stay on this intelligent failure loop and not exit. So if I understand the technology correctly, the way that you'd share is by raising your hand, and then our great moderators hand over the microphone to you. So if you have an example, just click that raise hand button.
So I am patiently looking for someone to raise their hand, someone brave enough, because we learned that bravery was an important, either brave or very brave, who would be prepared to share one of their stories with us. And no one stepping up to the plate yet. Just any examples of how to overcome barriers. It's okay if we don't have anyone, but yeah, if you have an example of overcoming a barrier and what that looked like, I'd love to hear it. Otherwise, I can move on. So at the moment, we still don't have anyone raising their hands, and there's nothing in the question box, because if you don't want me to open up your mic so that you can verbally do it, if you just want to share a story in your question box, that's certainly another way to do it. But I think for the moment, Ashley, we're going to head back to you.
Oh, great.
We did have one person, and the response was that they actually they sought out the innovators. So they actually went looking for innovators on helping them deal with failure.
Interesting. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. Perhaps it makes sense to move on. There's more sharing ahead, as I warned you at the beginning. It's sharing failures time. As I said, I mentioned this was coming, that I would be asking for volunteers to share their failure stories. But of course, before we can share our failure stories, we first need to become great listeners of failure stories. Now, I understand that the majority of people on this call are actually trained in active listening, so I assume this exercise is going to be very easy for you. But I still want to pose the question to you: is what can a listener do to make you feel safe sharing your failure story and to help you learn? And just throw any ideas you have in the question box there, and we'll just make sure we get a little discussion going on this question.
So we're getting people responding to this now, Ashley, and we've had lack of judgment, which I'm not sure whether this was the response to your story time question. It could be, but understanding and confidentiality, give you space and time to tell your story, so no interruptions. Acknowledge what they're saying. Anything else from anybody else? What else makes a good active listener?
Oh, those are great answers. Like I said, I expected this group to
eye contact.
Be good at this question.
So again, coming back with the acknowledging what they're saying, good eye contact.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you very much for participating. As I said, I recognize you're all trained in this, but I just want to add a few extra items because I run this exercise a lot, and I find that there are just a few things that tend not to come up that are specific and unique to failure. So the first that I'd mention, and I kind of touched on these earlier, but you're listening to these stories, recognizing that failure shows leadership, it shows innovation, it shows smart risk-taking. There is no shame in failure. As we saw in the poll, we have all failed. Keep in mind that also that failure is relative. I mean, it changes with time, perceptions, and perspectives. To the first point on the slide here, it's really important to suspend assumptions and keep an open mind, recognizing that everyone's perspective is valid, true, and useful. This one is particularly important, recognizing that it takes immense courage to tell a failure story. You know, it might seem surface level to you as the listener, but I can guarantee that the speaker always feels they're being more vulnerable than you hear. And next on the list, it's your job to react to failure stories with appreciation and curiosity for what was learned, never react negatively. And of course, get permission before retelling someone's story, and push the storyteller to deepen their learning by asking so what and now what type questions. So now I'd like to very quickly, now that we've become all, instantly become great listeners to failure stories, I'd like us all to work on what it means to be a great teller of failure stories. I'm going to do this by retelling my failure story, but this time I'm going to tell it really, really poorly. So it's up on the screen there. So I got funding from Engineers Without Borders to start a website so that failures and learning could be shared. No one used the site. Engineers Without Borders didn't see the potential and cut funding to the project, so it failed. I would love for you just to take a few seconds and think of, basically, how could this story be better? It's very hard to learn anything from this story. What would you do to improve it? And if you just throw in the box.
So some people are now responding, Ashley, and Justine's indicated that more detail is needed. I wouldn't mind adding some of my own. This was a new and exciting idea. It hadn't been tried before. So even thinking out of the box to try it in the first place could probably have been included in your story.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I put up some, I guess, this one's the easier of the exercises, I guess. It becomes pretty obvious what a good failure story looks like. But I've listed some of the top points here that it's important to tell a story. Add those details, make it personal, tell one that has meaning to you. Really important is to not blame. You'll notice the way that I told that story. It sounds like it's Engineers Without Borders failure for not understanding my brilliance, when really it was just that the site wasn't a good idea. Looking for root causes, really, I didn't explain why people didn't visit the site or what was wrong. Focused on the learning. I didn't tell you, what did I take from that? How did I apply that to my next project? What did I learn from that that would be useful to the listener? And I certainly didn't include perspectives from other stakeholders. I mean, if Engineers Without Borders was going to tell that story, they would certainly not tell that story like that. So those are some best practices as far as being a listener to failure stories and being a teller of failure stories go. So I'm going to say that we are ready, and I'm going to put it out there. I know it's a risk, but that's kind of my job, so I'll put it out there. Is there anyone who is incredibly courageous on the webinar right now who has a teachable moment, otherwise known as a failure story, that they would like to share with the group? Of course, there's zero pressure or expectation, but if you have a story that you'd like to share, then click the raise hand button, and as you're deciding if you want to share your story, I will put down a couple of quick rules. The first is to make sure it is a professional failure. We're in a professional context, as we want to keep the learning relevant to the group. And the second rule is the Chatham House rule. And if you're unfamiliar with it, it basically just means that in respect of the courage of any of your peers who decide to share, that we ask that you only repeat the shared stories if you keep the identity of the storyteller anonymous. And then I'll just wait to see if anyone's raised their hand.
So Ashley, nobody has raised their hands yet, but I thought maybe I'd share a story if that's okay. Do you mind if I share one?
I would love you to, yeah.
Okay. Well, this comes from my experience working with one of my employers here in the Vancouver area, and we were really excited. We were building what turned out to be an extremely big transportation project initiative, and we had created the whole process design and what we were going to do, and we were going to go out and meet with all of the individuals in the different communities. We went out right at the very beginning. We came back to talk to them at the at 40% level, then also at the 80% level of design, and we came forward and we had a project. We knew what it was that the community wanted and what the community wanted to build. We built the trust, we built the relationships, we've done absolutely everything that we could to move this forward. We brought it to the decision makers, and the decision maker said, that's great, but we've actually decided that we're going to go in a different way. And I felt like a complete failure. I had asked all of these people to trust me in moving this process forward. I had asked them to believe in what we were doing. I had given them information. People made decisions on where they were going to live and what they were going to do as a result of the outreach that I was doing. And I had assumed that we'd had the decision makers on board throughout the entire process. I couldn't show my face in that community for a while. I was devastated. I honestly didn't know whether or not I was even in the right profession anymore, because my credibility had been out there, my credibility had been on the line, and I'd failed. I'd failed to deliver what I thought I should have been delivering. I'd failed to live up to the promises that I felt that I had made to the people that had participated in my process. And I have learned from my failure, and I actually share this story now because it's important that you can only promise what you can truly deliver on. And I couldn't deliver on a final decision, and I hadn't realized that. So it was devastating, and I can feel myself even now as I'm telling you the story feeling so uncomfortable. So my apologies, but that's my failure story.
Thank you so much for sharing. I love the opportunity that presents itself when we share our failure stories. It opens up this window of connection to somebody else, in that we can all share in that experience of having felt, devastated, feeling like we let people down, not delivering on our promises. So yeah, thank you very much for sharing. Is there anyone else that wants to share a failure story while we have this space?
So I'm not seeing any hands up, no, I'm not seeing any hands up and nothing else in the question box at the moment. So maybe we'll hand it back to you at the moment, Ashley.
All right. Well, I have a few more minutes here, and I want to leave you with an activity which has us interacting with failures in a totally different way than we're used to. So I've never tried this via webinar, so bear with me here. This is, again, a bit of an experiment. But on the screen right now, you will see Benjamin Zander. Ben, I assume I can call him Ben. It's cool. Ben is a famous conductor with the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra, and he's also an educator. He has this amazing video called How to Give an A. Unfortunately, our GoToWebinar doesn't allow me to stream video, but I highly recommend Googling How to Give an A, Benjamin Zander, after this talk and watching this video, because it's just really good and funny and a good laugh. But in this video, Ben talks about what our bodies do in times of failure. He talks about how when we fail, we tend to pull down and crouch down, and our shoulders hunch over and our head hangs. And he says that this is totally wrong because failure is the only way we learn. So he suggests, instead of letting our bodies pull down, that we should throw our arms up and say, "How fascinating," in times of failure. And again, this is a webinar first, but I'd like us all to try this. So I would like you to think of a failure and just go back to that failure. Perhaps it's the one that you were considering sharing with the group. Perhaps it's the one that you thought of when you answered the poll question. Go back to that failure, and you can imagine, the handful of other people on this call, all thinking about their failure. And everyone on the count of 3, I will ask you to throw your arms up and say, "How fascinating." So think of your failure, and instead of letting your body pull down, on the count of 3, we'll say, "How fascinating." And I get to do the same as well. So think of your failure. 1, 2, 3. How fascinating! So even though I can't see you, I will assume that everyone just threw their hands up and enjoyed interacting with failure in a totally crazy and new way.
You're getting little smiley faces, Ashley, on the screen. So
great. I am the first person to admit that the change in how we think about and feel and act in times of failure will not change overnight. But I hope at least that this talk has left you with a few ideas for building that practice into your work. So I want to leave you with our third and final poll question, which is, what do you intend to take forward from this talk?
thanks, Ashley. And so again, we have the 5 different options available to us. The greater awareness with an expanded perception of failure, the intention to discuss failures and learning more openly, the intention to adapt based on failures, other, and again, please use the question mark, the question box if you have any other recommendations, or I don't intend to change. And if that is the case, please do send us something in the question window as well. So we're going to close the poll down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And so the answers to the questions, Ashley, are greater awareness and expanded perception of failure is 75%. The intention to discuss is 63%. Intention to adapt based on failure is yahoo to everybody. Whoop, whoop. Sorry, this is me. It's 88%. And other, I have some in my other. And for some people, I don't intend to change. So let me just check my window box here and see what people have said. I will share some of these learnings with my team and some of the real nuggets I'm taking away. Thank you so much. And one of them was just kidding, and the other one was want to create an atmosphere of productive failure at work in my terms. So I think maybe the one was I don't intend to change could have been the people that are just kidding, but hard to know. But anyway, they're having fun with you as well, Ashley, as we move forward on this. But we're getting some really good questions in here now, Ashley, and I'd like to open it up. I don't know where you're at, but I'd like to ask some of these questions. What do you think? Okay, what do you think the difference is between a failure and a bad decision? So the difference between a failure and a bad decision.
You know, I get asked a lot about the language, and I feel like I should have more robust definitions around all the different ways that people describe failures as mistakes or errors or, you know, lessons learned if you want the euphemism. To me, I tend to stick by the word failure, despite its inadequacies, because it generates conversations that other terms don't. To me, failure comes with this very intense, as we saw at the beginning, emotional reaction to the word. So it really sparks that kind of dialogue that I think is missing in a lot of our workplaces. So, you know, fundamentally, do I see a difference between a bad decision and a failure? I'm sure there's someone smarter than me that has a really good definition for defining those two. I don't tend to separate them. I use failure as a catch-all term to generate the conversations that we need to have about those bad decisions and turn them into teachable moments.
Thanks, Ashley. Are there any more questions out there, or did anyone want to follow up on that? So really, so Justine's responded, really seeing a parallel with work and personal life with regards to failure. What is a failure anyways? Unexpected outcomes. What is a bad decision? Uncomfortable change? I think we need to take failure more lightly in our personal and professional lives.
Great point, Justine.
Thanks, Justine. You're getting that smiley face again, so you know we're good. We're moving here. So are there any more questions for Ashley? Ashley, do you have any more of your presentation?
No, actually, you know what? I will just leave you with one of my very favorite quotes, which is to just encourage everyone to pursue something so important that even if you fail, the world is better off with you having tried. And if any of this was of interest to you, or you feel like continuing the conversation, feel free to get in touch with me. My contact details on the website there, or I'm constantly on Twitter. So look forward. It was really a pleasure to be invited to give this webinar. So thank you for inviting me into your community of practice here. And yeah, hopefully keep in touch.
So Ashley, thank you very much. On behalf of IAP2 USA and IAP2 Canada, we really appreciated you taking the time to share your knowledge with us and some of your failures as well. I hope if you're interested, please contact Ashley directly. We will be, this webinar has been taped and we will be getting it up online in the next little while. Don't forget to join us for next month's webinar, which will be announced in the very near future. We'd hope to have it available for you today, but not quite there yet, but it will be coming, so please stay tuned for the June webinar. And again, thank you for joining us. It's been a real pleasure, and we'll talk with you next month. Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye now.